Okay, so again, we have a double parsha, and I hope you generally understand the concept of a double parsha, and that is some years in the Jewish calendar are 12-month years, and once in a while we have a leap year. Last year was a leap year, an extra month of Adar. This year is a regular year. There's no extra month of Adar. Just as a total digression, why do we have a concept of leap year? And that's because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. It is based on 12 revolutions of the Earth. Of the moon around the Earth. And that adds up to 354 days. A solar calendar, which is the Earth revolving around the sun, is 365 and a fourth approximately. And therefore the Jewish year is 11 days shorter. And that accumulates. So every single year, the connection between the Jewish date and the secular date is going to be earlier and earlier and earlier. So if Pesach, year 1, is April 15, year 2, it'll be April 4, year 3, it'll be in March, year 4, it'll be in February, etc. And the problem is the Torah requires that Pesach be observed in the spring. So whenever Pesach is getting too early, we got to add an extra month before Pesach to push it. So that's the idea of a leap year, is to kind of coordinate a lunar calendar with a solar adjustment because of Pesach. Pesach has to be spring rejuvenation. Now because of that, the number of parshiot of the Torah reading is going to vary. In a leap year, you're going to have more Torah readings, 4 more readings than in a non-leap year. And that is why when it's a non-leap year, we combine certain parshiot, because we're going to have fewer Torah readings. In a leap year, we separate them. Okay, that's just a total digression, but just for your information, in case you didn't know it. So once again, this year is a non-leap year, so once again, we're going to be reading a double parsha. Baruch Hashem, we have a relatively fast Balkore, so it doesn't take that long. Now, both of the parshios, this is always the case, have very, very interesting topics in them. The first parsha, Bahar, has many, many halachot, and the first halacha it introduces is a halacha that was just relevant the past year, and that is the laws of Shemittah. The laws of Shemittah tell us that every 7th year in the land of Israel, the land is supposed to lie fallow, and God will take care of us. And it says that if you say, what will we eat? God promises there'll be an abundance of blessing in the 6th year that will carry you over till the time you'll be able to farm. And again, I don't know how many, some of you were not here, some of you were here. I don't know how involved you were in Shemitah. Most of you are not gardeners, etc. But Shemitah is a very, very important mitzvah that is still carried out even today. Interestingly enough, there are 2 aspects of Shemitah. One is an aspect that only applies in the land of Israel. The other is an aspect that even applies outside of the land of Israel, even if you're in New York or whatever it is. The Shemitah of agricultural restrictions, letting the land lie fallow, not planting, not plowing, that only applies in Eretz Yisrael. If you're in California, you can plant your lettuce or whatever you want to do. However, there's another aspect of Shemitah, which is cancellation of debt. Very interesting. People aren't so aware of that. If I lent you money and the Shemitah year comes, Shemitah cancels indebtedness. Now that's the end of Shemitah, meaning during Shemitah I could still get you, but if I didn't collect the debt and Shemitah passes, it's like an automatic bankruptcy discharge. Shemitah, I used to teach bankruptcy in my other life. So Shemitah cancels the debt. That's called, so the first thing is called Shemitat Karka, releasing the land. The second thing is called Shemitat Kesafim, releasing a debt. However, there's a famous way to avoid releasing of the debt. If you didn't do it, it's too late, so it's not going to help you now. And that is a takana of Hillel, who basically said there's something called pruzbul, where you essentially assign the debt to a beit din, and the halacha is court debts owed to a beit din do not get canceled, like traffic tickets or whatever it would be, and by assigning my debt to the court that then gives me permission to collect it, it doesn't get canceled. and therefore you make a prusbul before the end of the Shemitah year, meaning before Rosh Hashanah this year, and that allows you to collect your debts. And the Gemara in Gittin discusses how could Hillel change the Torah's law, etc. And there is a discussion in the Gemara exactly what was the mechanism that Hillel was authorized to employ. So this is Shmitat Karka, Shmitat Ksafim. The overall message of Shmitat Karka certainly is that just as there are 6 days of work followed by a Shabbos, so too the land. There are 6 years you work the land, followed by a Shabbos of the land. The land gets a Shabbos, and it is recorded that the great Rav Kook in Shemitah years would go around kissing the trees, wishing them a good Shabbos. Good Shabbos tree, good Shabbos trees, good Shabbos tree. Now, even stuff that grew without agricultural cultivation, like fruit on trees. I have apple trees. I didn't cultivate it, I didn't do anything wrong, but the trees produced apples. Do you know that another aspect of Shemitah is that all the fruit that grows is hefker, it's ownerless. So everybody can go in and take it. So if I had, during Shemitah, an apple tree, and the apple tree produced fruit, you would be allowed, at any time you want, to go in and pick that fruit. I would not be allowed to stop you. And indeed, the halacha says, if I try to lock my gate, well, it depends. So it's like this. Technically, I shouldn't even lock my gate, but let's assume I'm afraid of thieves or criminals or terrorists. So I am allowed to lock my gates, but I have to put a sign that says, anybody who wants apples, call this phone number and I'll let you in. Meaning you actually have to give a person access, even if you lock your gate for security reasons or animals or whatever the reason is.
Pick your own apples from the tree.
Okay. So here's the thing: you're no worse than anybody else, but you're no better than anybody else. Meaning to say, people are only allowed to pick in small quantities, like one day at a time. Like I can't come into your backyard and pick all of your apples, but I can pick apples for one day for me and my family. Now, of course, if I'm a big apple eater, that might be a lot, but that. So you, as the owner, are no worse than anybody else. So you can do the same thing, but you can't stop anybody else from doing that. Now, there's even a little bonus, and that is the stuff that grows on Shemitah is exempt from the Truma and the Maser. You know that in Eretz Yisrael, kashrus is even more complicated than elsewhere, because you're in New York, and well, let's say you're a place that doesn't have a lot of kosher food. I mean, New York does, but let's assume you're in Montana, so there may not be a lot of kosher food. But I can always tell you, but you can buy fruits and vegetables. In Israel, unfortunately, I can't even tell you that, because there's all sorts of tithing requirements of fruits and vegetables, and that's why any kosher store will have a sign that says the appropriate tithing was removed. So now the truth is, you could do it yourself. It's not like an impossible thing, but still, if you're not familiar with it, it's a little complicated. So it's better to buy things that are pre-tithed. But the bonus is, Shemitah produce does not have to be tithed. So you can eat it without any particular problem. So that makes life even easier. Now, again, the Shemitahs, we have a long time till the next Shemitah. As you know, the Israeli chief rabbinate works with a certain unique heter that was developed in the time of Rav Kook, going all the way back to the early 20th century. And this is called heter mechira. Fascinating. And that is, when Rav Kook was the chief rabbi, the inhabitants of Israel were very, very poor. And there was a real risk that if they could not farm the land, there might be starvation. So Rav Kook, he was not the first one, but he institutionalized it. Rav Kook developed an idea that just as we sell our chametz to non-Jews, which permits us to use it after Pesach, because it's not our chametz during Pesach, right? That's a familiar idea. Right? Everybody sells not everybody, but most people sell their chametz. So Rav Kook developed the idea that we could sell our land to the non-Jew, who technically will own all of the farmable land, and that will allow the land, even the Jewish guy, to farm the land, because it is the land of a non-Jew that will not be subject to Shemitah laws. So Rav Kook basically developed an idea that the chief rabbinate sell, of course you have to agree as an owner, but if you as a farmer agree, they put down your name and they sell your land to some Arab, a designated person, who is technically the owner of the land for the whole year. And al yedei kach, through that mechanism, they allow the farmer to continue to work the land and produce things with the idea that the non-Jew is not going to demand ownership. Again, you got to pick a non-Jew that you trust. Otherwise, he's going to wind up owning, the whole country. And now, this is called heter mechira. Now, even now, although it's not really that relevant now, but you'll see on packages or hashgachos in Rabbanut restaurants that, maybe you shouldn't go to, but you'll see the sign. It'll say heter mechira in Hebrew, meaning that means we use produce via the sale of, again, right now it's not so relevant, but certainly during Shemittah it was very, very relevant. Heter mechira produce. And this is an extremely controversial heter. Some say even Rav Kook would not have allowed it today. Rav Kook only permitted it because there would have been mass starvation, so he needed to be more lenient because it was almost a matter of life and death. Today it is not. Today a lot of food is imported from other countries. People are not going to starve. So some say that the Rabbanut is misusing the heter of Rav Kook because the conditions were totally different. Others say, no, a heter is a heter, and halachically it's going to be valid. Again, I'm not here to make any decision about this, and it's not really relevant that much now anyway. But it is interesting that you'll see that a lot of companies have two different packages. It's so interesting. Let's take potato chips. So some potato chips are labeled heter mechira, meaning they relied on this heter mechira. Other potato chips are non-heter mechira. And it depends on the neighborhoods. In other words, Osam or whatever company, they distribute it where they're going to make sales. So if you go to Tel Aviv or the airports, you'll see a lot of heter mechira potato chips. You go to Haredi neighborhoods, they don't sell them there. So basically they make two different types, and they put one type in some neighborhoods, one type in the other neighborhood, right? So it's interesting same company. They have two varieties. Whatever. In other words, the non-heter mechira are imports, potatoes from Europe or whatever it is, but it's more expensive for them. So they prefer to do heter mechira from here, but they know they're not going to be able to sell it in Haredi neighborhoods, so they have to have a non-heter mechira in smaller quantities that they market in Haredi. So I know this, my own bitter experience. You want to get some potato chips in the airport during Shemittah, you're not going to find. If you don't rely on the heter mechira, you're just not going to find it. Right? So it's interesting that the heter mechira is more prominent in some neighborhoods than it is in other neighborhoods. But as I say, this is one of the most interesting discussions. The Chazon Ish, who was very against the heter mechira, actually pointed out an interesting thing that people don't always realize. It is actually prohibited by the law of the Torah to sell land in Israel to non-Jews. You're not allowed to sell land to non-Jews. So how could there be a heter mechira? You're not allowed to sell the land in the first place. Now, Rav Kook was not ignorant of this prohibition, and Rav Kook obviously addressed this, and Rav Kook's answer was that if selling the land to the non-Jew is going to help the Jewish population, it's going to be mutter. In other words, the Torah doesn't want you to dilute Jewish control over the land of Israel, but this is the other way around. This will foster the building. So again, the Chazon Ish didn't accept it. In other words, the Chazon Ish did say it was usher, but people shouldn't think, Rav Kook missed, the issur of selling land to a non-Jew. He certainly was aware of it, and he wrote a whole book, Shabbat Haaretz, defending the heter mechira. And it's a big controversy even today. Rav Ovadia, who was chief rabbi, and his son is chief rabbi, Sephardic, said heter mechira is perfectly fine. Among the Ashkenazim, most of the Ashkenazim don't, unless you're a Dati Leumi, religious Zionist, most of the Ashkenazim are against the heter mechira. Yeah.
It almost sounds like he was trying to split the damage across the two mitzvahs or the two violations. So both the working of the land, but also the selling of the land, and it wasn't quite selling because it would turn back.
Would go back,
it wasn't
right.
quite working because it was being worked by someone who didn't quite own the land.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. So there were compromises, balances. And now again, I think the historical argument is quite strong that Rav Kook was dealing with a truly extreme situation of poverty that does not exist today. And therefore, the unusual difficulty of this, and we don't realize this, people were dropping dead in the street. Unfortunately, the Holocaust has overshadowed the difficulties that existed before the Holocaust. But because it was so devastating. But in pre-Holocaust Palestine, as it was called, there was starvation. People would drop dead in the streets, and therefore Rav Kook felt he needed to come up with some way to allow agriculture to continue, and he developed this through the concept of heter mechira. Yeah.
Is the land at rest based on the Jews owning the land?
So that's part of the controversy itself, meaning the obvious assumption of the heter mechira is that the holiness of the land is diluted when it is owned by a Gentile, and therefore, essentially, land owned by a Gentile in Israel becomes like land owned in New York, meaning it no longer has the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. So it's interesting. That's the very reason why you're not supposed to sell, but that would be the reason why you'd be allowed to work it during Shemitah. But that's the controversy. There were those who took the position that, hey, that's not the case.
But there's another prohibition about putting a non-Jew in a position of authority. So if you have a non-Jew owning the land and Jews working the land, technically you're an employee of a non-Jew at that point.
Yeah, that's correct. That's the same. Yeah, that's the same problem of selling the land to a non-Jew generally, and this would include that. But again, Rav Kook said you have to look at the long-term benefit here, and the long-term benefit is actually enhancing the stature of the Jewish people in their lands, and therefore, in terms of a long term, it is not subordinating us, it is actually elevating us and putting us in a stronger economic position. So be it as it may, again, this is not going to be a full discussion, Amir Hashem. I mean, hopefully Mashiach will be here before then, but Amir Hashem, if that's not the case, and we'll be discussing Shemitah when Shemitah comes, so we'll spend more time on the discussion of the heter mechira. But just to be aware of it, you'll see it on packages. Just to be aware of what it means, and that it is the big Shemitah controversy in the land of Israel every year, not every year, every Shemitah year. This controversy is going to reemerge, and the like. Okay. But now I want to mention an interesting thing. When the Torah talks about the concerns that people are going to have because of Shemitah. So it says, and if you say, what shall I eat during the 7th year? I'm not allowed to plant, etc. If you will say that, so God says, I command my blessing upon you, that the 6th year you will have enough for the remaining of the 6th year, for the 7th year, and even in the 8th year until the new crop of the 8th year comes. In other words, you'll basically get double. You'll get, because obviously you're harvesting in the 6th, so that'll cover the end of the 6th year, the whole 7th year, the 8th year. Now, people ask an interesting question. And again, I'm going backwards because Shemitah passed, but still it's in the Parsha, so it's relevant. And that is, you may remember, I don't know if you remember or not, that there were a lot of fundraising campaigns for farmers. In other words, there would be tzedakah organizations that say, give money to the farmers who will be struggling. These are the farmers who don't rely. And remember, the farmers who rely on heter mechira continue to make their living. That's fine. But we're talking about the farmers, more Haredi, who do not rely on heter mechira, so they're not going to farm their land. Right? There are farmers who will not farm their land. They're allowed to do maintenance on trees so they won't die, but they're not allowed to plant anything. So the tzedakah organizations say these farmers have to be taken care of. They're heroes. And there are tzedakah campaigns that raise millions and millions of dollars or shkalim for the farmers who keep Shemitah. And it's a worthy tzedakah. But the question is, why do we have to have tzedakah organizations for the farmers who keep Shemitah? Doesn't the Torah itself say that they're going to get enough in the 6th year to carry them through? So what's the problem? Are we not believing the Torah, or God forbid, is the Torah not true? What's going on? And is it in fact the case that the farmers are getting this unusual prosperity? So people, if you want to be cynical, but it's a good question, why should I give to a Shemitah fund? God says he'll take care of them. Yeah.
It's because the Shemitah fund is just a messenger for the farmers.
Okay, so there are a few different approaches of saying. One approach, which is more of a technical approach, is that most opinions say that the observance of Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is only rabbinic. The Torah does not require Shemitah, because Shemitah depends on the Jubilee year, and the Jubilee year depends on most of the Jews being in Israel, and most of the Jews are not yet in Israel, and therefore Shemitah is rabbinic, and the promise of the Torah is only for a Torah Shemitah, and not a rabbinic Shemitah, and therefore we need tzedakah campaigns, because Shemitah is not mandatory under Torah law. That's answer number one. Answer number two might be, again, this is just might be, that the Torah's promise of prosperity is only if the whole nation of Israel is keeping Shemitah. If Klal Yisrael keeps Shemitah, this is God's blessing. But where you have a situation where, unfortunately, most of the Jewish people, even in Israel, are not keeping Shemitah, so even if I'm keeping Shemitah, I'm going to suffer, because the bracha comes to the nation that complies with God's law and not to the individual. So I, as an individual, may not merit the blessing because the nation of Israel is not keeping the ritual properly. And a third answer would be your answer, but you need a little redefinition, in the sense that when the Torah says, I will give you parnasa, even though the Torah specifically mentions, I will give you a yield that will be double, that may be just a particular way that God gives his bracha, but it's not the only way. Meaning, God basically says, you won't starve. But God has many ways that you won't starve. You won't starve because he'll give you a crop yield, or you won't starve because your brethren will come together to take care of you. In other words, it's still a fulfillment of the bracha, because I, who am giving tzedakah to people who keep Shemitah, am a conduit for the bracha of Hashem. Now, it's a very logical answer. The problem is a little bit that it does require a non-literal reading of the Chumash, because the Chumash says specifically it'll come through the prosperity of the crop, and now we're saying, well, it doesn't have to be that way. It could be another way. But again, I think it's a very definitely a possible answer. So that's one issue. And by the way, though, I want to say, in spite of all of these answers, while it may be true that a Shemitah farmer will not always get double or whatever it is, but there are cases where it does happen. There are some very unusual, amazing cases of two farmers next to each other. One keeps Shemitah, one doesn't. And the one who didn't keep Shemitah, had a crop failure, and the one who kept Shemitah got a huge harvest the year before. So it may not be every case today for various reasons, but even Bisman Hazeh, there are cases where these things do happen, and it's a mitzvah to be aware of them, because there is at least this partial fulfillment of exactly what the Torah says. Okay, but there's another question that people raise on this verse, and that is, the verse is worded a very peculiar way. If you say, how will I survive? God says, I'll give you double. Well, what if you don't say? In other words, it implies that if you complain, I'll give you something. Or if you're worried. Meaning, if you don't complain, I won't give you any. What is it? God should just say, I'll give you double. So the Saporno, right, one of the great commentators on the Chumash, is Rav Ovadia Saforno. He was from Italy, Renaissance Italy. And his commentary is one of the great commentaries on the Chumash, says a very beautiful thought. He says, the real bracha of Hashem is not in quantity, but it's in quality. Pirkei Avos says, Ezeu Asher, who is the truly wealthy person? Hasameach b'chelko, he who rejoices, he who is happy with his lot. I'm sure you've all learned this, you've all heard this many times. But, it's worthy to think about how true, absolutely true it is. A person could have so much money and be bitter and depressed and angry. And a person can have very little and can have an inner joy and contentment. It absolutely is the case. Now, sometimes you get hit with a double whammy. You're very poor and you're bitter. Okay, that's you're hit in both directions. But at least potentially, a person can have a tremendous inner simcha. Sameach b'chelkai. In fact, I think the Stipler said this. It is said in the Ramah that if you're a sandik at a bris, a sandik, the one who holds the baby at the bris, that is a bracha, you'll become wealthy. You'll become very, very wealthy. And that's why the minhag is, you try to have a different sandik for every bris, because you want to spread the wealth around. Right? I don't want to give the sandik to the same person all the time. So Rav Chaim Kanevsky asked his father, the Stipler, who had been a sandik 5,000 times, he says, how come you're not rich? You're poor? So I think the Stipler gave two answers. One is, Sameach b'chelkai is rich, so I'm rich in that way, Sameach b'chelkai. And the other was, when he said, is that rich is you get whatever it is you truly want in life. And the Stipler said, what he really wanted in life was that his svarim would be learnt by people. And indeed, it's very much the case that the Kehilos Yaakov, which is his works on Talmud, are very, very widely learned in all of the yeshivas. So he actually got his wealth that way. So the supporter says by Shemitah, if you're not a person who worries, you accept whatever Hashem gives you as good. You don't need a bracha in quantity. You will have the inner simcha, that even the little bit that you have will satisfy you. But if you're a complainer, then Nebuch, God has to give you the consolation prize of a lot of quantity, because you were not happy with the little. But the ultimate bracha is to be happy. Sameach b'chelkai.
So, let's say in the hydroponical, that we grow a lot of vegetables and so on stuff without even using the land. What's the
Oh, hydroponic. Yeah. So that's a very good point. In fact, the halacha is, even in Israel, if you're growing things that are not from the land, hydroponic, the Shemitah laws do not apply. And indeed, that is one of the ways that vegetables are grown during the Shemitah year. But it is tricky, because you really have to know exactly what the process is, meaning there is hydroponic that uses bags of dirt or whatever it is. So, you have to know. But if it's purely without any soil from Eretz Yisrael, it does not have the laws of Shemitah. That's true. Yeah.
How does Foreign explain the Pasuk of Pasuk that says that I'll give you double in the year before?
No, it says, if you ask, what will I eat? Meaning, if you're anxious and afraid, so Hashem says, I'll give you a big quantity. But if you're not anxious and afraid, you'll get the bracha of Sameach b'chelkai, which is even a great. That's what the Seporno says. So that reminds you. I remember when I my wife and I came to Ohr Somayach 2010, so I've been here since then. But back in 1999, I was here on a one-year sabbatical. So I actually taught for Ohr Somayach for 1 year as a visitor. So I remember walking, this is back in 1999, a long time ago, walking on Shmuel Hanavi. And I remember, still this picture I have in my mind, of 4 kids who are really skipping during the street, very happy. And they were sharing a popsicle. 4 kids were sharing one popsicle. Now, putting aside the hygienic issue, once again, in Israel we're not so big on meticulous on that. But they were having such a great time. They were laughing and playing, and they were so excited that they had this popsicle. Obviously, they were a poor family. They couldn't afford. Popsicles are not that expensive. No, I'm just guessing, but I guess they couldn't afford 4 or whatever it would be. And they were sharing and they were enjoying. Then I think about, sometimes the spoiled American kid, who doesn't have his own iPhone or doesn't have his own TV. Hey, I got to share it with my sister. What's going on here? And who's richer? Who is richer? The Sameach b'chelkai with very little, or the person that has so much, but they want more and they're not really happy with what they have, right? So that, to me, that was actually an illustration of the meaning of a Zeu Asher HaSameach b'chelkai. So that's something to think about in our lives. Obviously, in American culture, material success is a very, very important thing. In fact, in some ways, it measures who you are. If you're not successful, you're kind of like a nobody. But that's not how the Torah defines a person's success in life. Now, again, I'm not talking about full-time kollel and not working. I'm talking about, get a job and work and support your family. I'm not giving you any speech about not doing that. But understand that ultimately your worth is not based on making a lot of money. Your worth is based on how good a person you are, how much of a servant of Hashem are you, to serve Hashem, to do mitzvos, to learn Torah, to develop attributes of kindness and consideration for others, to be a good husband, to be a good father. These are the things that ultimately measure. And, you don't have to be a lawyer or a doctor. I mean, Baruch Hashem, there are lawyers and doctors who do that. I don't mean to knock it. But the truth is, you can do it as a car mechanic and you can do it as a janitor, because ultimately who you are is not defined by what you do or how much money you make. And you think about it as you go through life. We often say that, we go to school to learn how to make a living. But you have to remember that we spend so much time in learning how to make a living that we never learn how to make a life. And making a life is a lot more important than making a living. Although, again, making a living is important. I'm not disparaging that at all. Okay, this has nothing to do with, convincing you to stay in Kolo for 20 years or whatever. That's a separate discussion and whatever. But I'm just referring to just having a sense of priority in your life. So this brings me to one final point I want to discuss, and that is there's a fascinating machlokas in Maseches Brachos in the 3rd chapter. It says in the 2nd paragraph of Shema that if you keep Hashem's mitzvos, He will give you grain and you will gather your grain. V'yasafta deganecha. You will gather your grain. So there's a machlokas between two rabbis how to interpret that pasuk. Rabbi Yishmael says, if the Torah says you will gather your grain, we see from here you're allowed to be involved in economic activity. In other words, it's not bittul Torah. You're allowed to farm your land. You're allowed to gather your grain.
Mitzvah, no?
It's a mitzvah, yeah. So that seems logical. But interestingly enough, the great Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we just commemorated his yahrzeit, his death, in which he revealed the Zohar, Lag Bomer, right, 2 days ago. I don't know if anyone here go to Meron? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay.
6 hours.
The trip?
No, listening to the same song.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Meron, I always tell people, you have to go to Meron at least once in your life, but maybe only once in your life. It's something. Although I'll tell you, if you go to Meron on the off season, it's a different experience. If you went today to Meron, you'd have the whole kever to yourself. There'd be 10 people there, or whatever it is. It's a different experience, and some people actually find it better for them before or after Lag BaOmer than on Lag BaOmer itself.
We were taking it before. I for a previous trip. So we've now been there to the kever twice. Once when it was pretty chill, and now when it was the opposite.
Yeah. Again, whenever you go to Tzfat, you go to Meron. Meron is just one hill across. Tzfat and the like. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has an extreme interpretation. He says to Rabbi Yishmael, working? Who ever heard of working? You're going to plant when it's time to plant, and harvest when it's time to harvest, and thresh when it's time to thresh. How will you serve Hashem? So he says an amazing thing, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. When the Torah says you will gather your grain, that is referring to Jews who are not doing the will of God. Now, Tosfos asks right away, what do you mean, Jews who are not doing the will of God? The pasuk says, if you listen to my mitzvos, you will gather your grain. It's talking about people who are doing the will of God. How can he say it's talking about people who are not doing the will of God? So Tosfos answers, they're doing the will of God, but in a suboptimal way. Meaning, they're doing the mitzvos, but the fact that they're going to work, not really the will of God. God says, learn Torah and I'll take care of you. Very extreme view. So the Gemara then said, and by the way, it worked for him, by the way, because he was in a cave for 12 years, and that's exactly how he lived. The birds brought him meat, and there was trees that grew up next to him, so he had fruit, and there were streams of water. So his basic attitude was, hey, it worked for me, it'll work for you. Very extreme. So the Gemara then says, many people followed Rabbi Yishmael. They combined their Torah learning with Parnasa, and God blessed them. Many people tried to be like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. They basically, I'm going to learn, you God, take care of me. And it didn't work. So the Gemara seems to indicate that the normal, proper way is to follow the way of Rabbi Yishmael. But one might suggest that Shemitah is every 7th year. God wanted us to live a little bit like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, to kind of put yourself totally in God, and God will take care of you. So in a sense, the madrega of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is normally a level that's too high for us. We're not supposed to even follow it. But every once in a while, God says, try it. Put your emunah in Hashem, and Hashem will take care of you. So one can look at Shemitah as following Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai for the people who normally follow the midah of Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, so that's some perspectives on Shemitah. And once again, what's important is, just like we say that the lessons of Shabbos you have to carry into the week, meaning your Shabbos is not a real Shabbos unless it changes your Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, meaning the lessons of Shabbos I got to carry. So too, even though it's after Shemitah, I think the lessons of Shemitah got to carry over, meaning Shemitah teaches me that God takes care of me. Well, even the other 6 years where I do the work of farming, I have to know that Hashem is the really one that's taking care of me even then. Meaning, yeah, I have to do the work, but without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing will be blessed. So in a sense, just as Shabbos teaches me about my week, Shemitah teaches me about the other 6 years. Okay, you'll have a good Shabbos. And